So this happened yesterday on old Fox News.
America was not founded on racism. Don't get me wrong. Yeah, there was slavery going on, but slavery itself was not initially a racist thing. It never was about race initially. So to sit there and take it like America was founded on racism, it's a complete lie.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so here's the problem. History would like to have a word with either that guy or whoever brokered his soul. Hope he got a good check. Okay, see, the way that the MAGA right is currently in this country, going to war over history and anti-racism education when they fake call it critical race theory. It's basically a freakout over white Americans becoming more woke on matters of race. Now, you'd think, based on that freakout, that critical race theorists or authors of wokeness self-help books like Robin DiAngelo or anti-racism author Ibram X. Kendi invented race to hear the right-wingers tell it. But the truth is, if y'all hate talking about race, you're going to want to have a word with your precious founding fathers. Because as actual critical race theorists will tell you, race is not a biological reality. It's a cultural construct, and one that was literally an idea born right here in the good old USA. Now, for most of semi-modern human history, Europeans didn't even use the term white to describe anything other than wealthy women who didn't work in the fields or in the mines. It wasn't until the 17th century when the Europeans who colonized this country started using white to distinguish themselves from the so-called savages, the indigenous people they initially tried to enslave, but mostly killed off with germs, and from those of African descent, who they decided, by definition, because they had colored blood, were unequal and therefore enslavable. And not just them, but also their children and their children's children forever, to be owned by the slave owner and to be traded and sold around like cattle, which is why American slavery was called chattel slavery. And that was true even if their children looked like this. They passed a Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 that gave any white person the right to kidnap and re-enslave any black person who escaped from bondage and even collect a bounty. They even invented words, like entire words, to designate how much colored blood a person had in them. Octoroon for 1/8 African American and quadroon for 1/4 and mulatto. Race is very much an American, specifically a white American invention. Enter one Homer Plessy, a very dapper 19th century New Orleans shoemaker born in 1862 as a free colored person, his descriptor under American law. Besides being a shoemaker, Mr. Plessy was an activist. He was part of a group in New Orleans who were determined to overturn the laws that began segregating white and non-white people after Union troops pulled out of the South in 1877. Now, no one really knows what he looked like, but this mural is a pretty good guesstimate. Because Homer Plessy, who descended from the white Haitian plantation owners who fled to New Orleans after the enslaved rebelled and overthrew slavery there, was only 1/8 black. In American terms, an octoroon. In short, he looked very much like a white man. At age 30, he volunteered to challenge the Louisiana Separate Cars Act of 1890, which designated nice, clean train cars for white riders and basic, barely better than cattle cars for colored riders, but technically equal accommodations. So on a hot day in June of 1892, Mr. Plessy bought a first-class ticket in a whites-only car in New Orleans, and he'd been chosen, by the way, to be the guy because of how white he looked. A conductor who was also in on the plan asked him if he was colored. When he said, "Yes, I am," the conductor ordered him to sit in the colored car. After he refused, he was dragged off the train in handcuffs and charged with violating that Separate Cars Act. The citizens group hired Albion Winigar Turgay, a white lawyer from New York who had fought for the rights of African Americans. And Mr. Turgay filed suit against the judge who originally charged Mr. Plessy, Judge John H. Ferguson. Now, unfortunately, the United States Supreme Court would reach the same decision in the infamous case Plessy versus Ferguson, which established the concept of separate but equal in American law, an idea that persisted all the way through the 1950s, when Rosa Parks did the exact same thing that Mr. Plessy did, volunteering as an activist member of the NAACP to refuse to move to the colored section of a public bus in the 1950s. But it was the way that the Plessy versus Ferguson ruling played out that relates to what we're dealing with today. In that infamous ruling, the justices found that there was nothing wrong with making Mr. Plessy and other colored riders use the separate car. Quote, we consider the underlying fallacy of Plessy's argument, Justice Henry Brown wrote, to consist in the assumption that the enforced separation of the two races stamps the colored race with a badge of inferiority. If this be so, it's not by reason of anything found in the act, but solely because the colored race chooses to put that construction upon it. In other words, it was basically just an inconvenience. It was separate, but so what? Black people could ride, right? If they felt bad about it, that was their own fault. No harm, no foul on America. And that's basically the same logic that Justice Samuel Alito used to justify the Arizona voter restrictions. Sure, having your polling place moved at the last minute because you're in a Democratic precinct is inconvenient, and making it so hard to vote absentee that only rich people can do it and mostly black and brown people get stuck standing in 7-hour lines is an inconvenience. But you can vote, right? Eventually, somewhere. And you can use that argument literally for almost anything. Like Tucker Carlson bemoaning diversity in neighborhoods. In his book, he writes, if you grew up in America, suddenly nothing looks the same. Your neighbors are different. You may not recognize your hometown. Human beings aren't wired for that. They can't digest change at this pace. Or when Rand Paul defended restaurant discrimination.
How about desegregating lunch counters? Lunch counters?
Well, what it gets into is that then if you decide that restaurants are publicly owned and not privately owned, does the owner of the restaurant own his restaurant, or does the government own his restaurant? These are important philosophical debates, but not a very practical discussion.
I mean, freedom of choice, am I right? Unless you want to have your staff or customers wear a mask or get vaxxed so they don't die of COVID. In short, the MAGA right wants to take us backwards to Homer Plessy's America, where discrimination and disparate treatment are just an inconvenience. And those demanding equality are the ones who've got the problem.